Section 1. The Ordinary World. A family in Baton Rouge. On a warm evening in early 1983, three brothers walked into their first karate class in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Their mother had signed them up after one of the boys brought home a flyer from Mayfair Elementary School. The oldest was Gary Jr., who everyone called Bubba. The youngest was Jeffrey Michael, who went by Mikey. April 27th, 1972, who everyone in the family called Jody. He was 10 years old. He loved sports. He played soccer, football, softball, and basketball. He was the kind of kid who was always moving, always outside with his friends. His parents, Leon Gary Plauché and June Sheridan Plauché, had 4 children total. Their only daughter was named Sissy Jennifer. The family lived in Baton Rouge, a city that sits right on the Mississippi River in the heart of Louisiana. It was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors, where kids played outside until the streetlights came on, where fathers coached their sons' sports teams and mothers packed lunches and drove carpool. Gary Plauché worked as a heavy equipment salesman. He had served as a staff sergeant in the United States Air Force before settling into civilian life. He was the kind of father who showed up to every game, who volunteered as a coach, who loved being called coach by his kids and their friends. June said he took great pride in being a good father. He was known around Baton Rouge as a funny guy, someone who made people laugh, someone who loved fishing and cooking and watching LSU Tigers football and cheering for the New Orleans Saints. Someone who saw beauty in everything, someone you could count on. By early 1983, Gary and June were having problems in their marriage. That summer, in August 1983, they separated. Gary moved out of the family home. They were in the middle of getting a divorce. It was a difficult time for everyone. The kids were adjusting to their father not being around every day. June was managing the household on her own. Gary was trying to stay involved with his children's lives, even though he no longer lived under the same roof. The family was doing what so many families do when a marriage falls apart. They were trying to hold things together. They were trying to keep life as normal as possible for the kids. And in the middle of all this change, Jody and his brothers started taking karate lessons from a 24-year-old instructor named Jeffrey Doucette. Doucette was originally from Port Arthur, Texas, a small city right on the Louisiana border. He was an ex-Marine. He had been working for his brother's business during the day, fitting carpets in people's homes, but his real focus was teaching martial arts. He taught a style called Hapkido, which is a Korean martial art that focuses on self-defense, joint locks, and kicks. Doucette had been living at the karate studio where he taught classes. He had made flyers and handed them out at local elementary schools, including Mayfair Elementary, where Jody was in 5th grade. When Jody first walked into that karate class in January 1983, he didn't think much of it. He had actually thrown his flyer in the trash. Mikey had brought one home, and their mother thought it would be good for the boys to try something new together. At first, Doucette seemed like a great teacher. The Plauché boys thrived under his instruction. He was patient. He was encouraging. He knew how to make karate fun for kids while also pushing them to improve. Jody got really good at it, really fast. Under Doucette's training, Jody even won a trophy at the Fort Worth Pro-Am, a karate competition in Texas. It was one of his proudest moments. He told a local newspaper at the time that Doucette was his best friend. All 3 brothers said the same thing. They loved their karate teacher. And Doucette didn't just stay at the studio, he became part of their lives outside of class. He came over to the house for family dinners. He played board games with the kids. He spent the night sometimes, sleeping on the couch. The Plauché family welcomed him in. They saw him as a positive role model for their sons, especially during a time when Gary wasn't living at home. June appreciated having another adult around who seemed to care about her kids. Doucette became what one family member later described as someone who filled the vacant role of family patriarch after Gary moved out. He spent more and more time with the children. He became an emotional support to June. According to a Washington Post article from that time, June even began an intimate relationship with Doucette after Gary had left the family home. Making himself indispensable. He was always available, always offering to help. always there when the family needed something. He drove the boys to competitions. He took them out for food after practice. He gave them money to run to the store and buy snacks. To everyone watching from the outside, Jeff Doucette looked like a blessing, a kind young man who was stepping up to help a family going through a hard time. But what nobody knew, what Gary and June had no way of seeing, was that Jeff Doucette had been grooming Jody for months. During karate practice, Doucette would tell Jody that his inner thighs were tight and needed to be stretched. He would help Jody get into stretching positions and put his hands on Jody's thighs, slowly moving closer to his private areas. At first, if his hand touched Jody's groin, Doucette would pass it off as an accident. "I didn't mean to," he would say. "My hand just slipped." But it kept happening, again and again. Jody, who was only 10 years old, didn't know what to make of it. He thought maybe it really was an accident. He didn't want to embarrass himself by making a big deal out of nothing. He didn't want to upset his teacher, who everyone loved. So he stayed quiet. Doucette also started offering to teach Jody how to drive. One day, Doucette had Jody sit on his lap in the driver's seat of his car, a 280Z. Jody held the steering wheel while Doucette controlled the pedals. But then Doucette's hands were in Jody's lap. Jody remembers thinking, "What's going on here? Maybe it's an accident." Years later, Jody would understand that Doucette was testing boundaries. This is what people who hurt children do. They test to see how far they can go. They do small things first to see if the child will tell anyone. If the child stays quiet, they push further. They create situations where inappropriate touching can be explained away as accidental. They make the child feel like they're overreacting, like they're imagining things. Doucette was very good at this. Jody later said that predators are good at what they do. Doucette wasn't just grooming Jody, he was grooming the entire family. He was making himself someone they trusted, someone they depended on, someone who seemed to genuinely care about their well-being. This made it nearly impossible for Jody to speak up. How could he accuse someone his whole family loved? How could he tell his mother that the man who had been so helpful, so kind, so Doucette enters the picture, time was hurting him. Jody figured that if he just stayed quiet, eventually Doucette would stop. He didn't want to upset his parents. He didn't want to cause more problems for a family that was already dealing with so much. So he kept going to karate. He kept spending time with Doucette, and the abuse continued. By late spring of 1983, the touching during stretches had turned into something worse. Doucette started sending the other students to a nearby 7-Eleven to buy snacks during practice. "Not you, Jody," Doucette would say. "I need to do some extra work with you." Then he would take Jody into the back room of the studio. What happened in those back rooms, what Doucette did to Jody when they were alone, escalated over the months that followed. The abuse started in March 1983 and continued for nearly a year. At its worst, it was happening almost every day, sometimes twice a day. Jody was trapped in a nightmare that nobody around him could see. To his parents, to his brothers, to everyone at the karate studio, everything looked normal. Jody was excelling at karate. He was winning trophies. He seemed happy. Doucette seemed like a devoted teacher and a good friend to the family. But behind closed doors, Jody was being sexually abused by the man everyone trusted, and he had no idea how to make it stop. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 2, The Fracture Point. Jeff Doucette enters the picture. Jeffrey Paul Doucette was born in February 1959 in Port Arthur, Texas, a small city that sits right on the border between Texas and Louisiana. He was one of 7 children. Not much is known about his early years, but later, when he was arrested, he told police that he himself had been sexually abused as a child. He claimed his own mother had mistreated him. When he became Section 2, he stopped being a victim and started hurting other children. He admitted to police that over the years, he had abused so many boys that he couldn't even remember all of their names or how many there were. At some point, Doucette and at least one of his brothers moved 185 miles away from Port Arthur to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, along with their father, who owned a service station. Their mother stayed behind in Port Arthur. By 1982, when Doucette was 23 years old, he was working as a karate instructor, He had been a Marine before that. The style of martial arts he taught was called Hapkido, which is a Korean fighting style that focuses on self-defense and using an attacker's own strength against them. Doucette was living at the karate studio where he held his classes. During the day, he worked for his brother's business, installing carpets in people's homes. But people around him noticed that he was spending less and less time fitting carpets, and more time focused on his karate classes. In late 1982, Doucette created flyers advertising his karate lessons and handed them out at local elementary schools around Baton Rouge. One of those schools was Mayfair Elementary, where 10-year-old Gary Plauché was in 5th grade. Jody actually threw his flyer in the trash. He wasn't interested. But his younger brother Mikey brought his copy home, and their mother June thought it would be a good idea for all 3 of her boys to try it. So in January 1983, Jody, Mikey and their older brother Bubba started taking karate lessons with Jeff Doucette. At first, everything seemed perfect. The boys loved Doucette. He was young, energetic and fun to be around. He knew how to talk to kids. He made karate exciting. He was the kind of teacher who took his students to the movies or to go skating. He gave them money to buy cokes and candy at the store. He treated them like friends, not just students. Jody later said that in his mind, Doucette became his best friend. His brothers felt the same way. Under Doucette's teaching, the Plauché boys got really good at karate. Their fitness improved. They became more disciplined. Jody especially thrived. He won a trophy at the Fort Worth Pro-Am competition under Doucette's guidance. It was one of the proudest moments of his young life. For Gary and June, watching their son excel was everything they had hoped for when they signed the boys up for lessons. They thought Doucette was a great role model. They thought he genuinely cared about their kids. But Doucette wasn't just teaching karate. He was doing something much more calculated. He was grooming the entire Plauché family. This is something that child abusers do. They don't just target the child, they target everyone around the child. They make themselves likable. They make themselves trusted. They make themselves needed. Dr. Anna Salter, a psychologist who studies people who hurt children, has explained that these kinds of offenders are very good at being charming. They have to be, because nobody would let them near their kids if they seemed creepy or dangerous. They build trust with parents, with families, with communities. That trust is what allows them to get access to children. Doucette didn't have a car, so he relied on the parents of his students to drive him places. Fracture Point, Baton Rouge, so the families of his students welcomed him into their homes. The Plauché family was one of those families. They realized that this young man was living at the karate studio and didn't have much of a home life, so they opened their door to him. Doucette started spending Saturday nights at the Plauché house. He ate dinner with them. He played board games with the family. They played Password and Trivial Pursuit together. He became part of their routine. Gary even arranged for Doucette to spend the night at Gary's own parents' house once, because Gary felt bad that Doucette was living at the studio. The Plauché family trusted Jeff Doucette completely. Then, in August 1983, Gary and June Plauché separated. They were getting a divorce. Gary moved out of the family home. This created a gap in the household. The kids missed having their father around every day. June was managing everything on her own. It was a difficult time for everyone, and Jeff Doucette saw an opportunity. He began spending even more time at the house. He became an emotional support for June. He helped with the kids. He filled the role that Gary had left behind. According to a Washington Post article from that time, June even began an intimate relationship with Doucette after Gary moved out. For the kids, especially for Jody, Doucette became something like a father figure. He was always there. He was always available. He was always offering to help. And for Gary, who was no longer living at home but still wanted to be involved in his children's lives, Doucette seemed like a positive presence. Gary was grateful that his sons had someone encouraging them, coaching them, pushing them to do their best. But while all of this was happening, while Doucette was becoming more and more embedded in the family, he was also slowly pushing boundaries with Jody. This is what abusers do. They test limits. They see how far they can go. They start with small things that can be explained away if the child reacts badly. Jody later explained this process when he became an adult. He said that Doucette would tell him during practice that his inner thighs were tight and needed to be stretched. So Doucette would help Jody into stretching positions and put his hands on Jodie's thighs. Then his hands would move closer and closer to Jodie's groin. If Doucette touched Jodie's private area, he would immediately say, "Oh, that was an accident. I didn't mean to. We were just stretching." This is called testing boundaries. Doucette was seeing whether Jodie would tell anyone. Jodie didn't. He thought maybe it really was an accident. He didn't want to make a big deal out of nothing. He didn't want to embarrass himself. When Doucette offered to teach Jodie how to drive, Jodie was excited. What 10-year-old boy wouldn't want to learn how to drive? Doucette had Jodie sit on his lap in the driver's seat of his car, a 280Z sports car. Jodie held the steering wheel while Doucette controlled the gas and brake pedals with his feet. But then Doucette's hands moved to Jodie's lap. Jodie thought, what's going on? Maybe his hands just slipped. He didn't say anything. Years later, Jodie understood that this was another test. Doucette was seeing how Jodie would react. When Jodie stayed silent, Doucette knew he could push further. There's another reason Jodie didn't speak up, and it's a reason that a lot of children in similar situations don't tell anyone what's happening to them. Gary had always been very protective of his kids. He used to tell people, "If anyone ever touches my kid, I'll kill them." Jodie heard him say this. Jodie knew his father wasn't joking. So when the abuse started, Jodie was terrified of what would happen if he told his dad. Analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the He was afraid his father would end up in jail. He was afraid of what it would do to his family, which was already dealing with the divorce. So he stayed quiet. He thought if he just kept his mouth shut and waited it out, eventually Doucette would stop. But Doucette didn't stop. In March 1983, about 2 months after the karate lessons started, the touching turned into sexual abuse. Jodie was 10 years old. The abuse happened in the back room of the karate studio. Doucette had a system. During practice, he would send all the other students to the nearby 7-Eleven convenience store to buy snacks. He would give them money and tell them to take their time. "Not you, Jodie," he would say. "I need to do some extra work with you." Then he would take Jodie into the back room. What Doucette did to Jodie in that room was not something a child should ever have to experience. It started as oral sex that Doucette performed on Jodie. Then it got worse. It turned into full rape. Jodie later said that at first, he couldn't even understand what was happening to him. He was only 10 years old. His brain couldn't process it. The abuse continued for months. By the time it reached its worst point, Doucette was assaulting Jodie almost every single day, sometimes twice a day. The abuse didn't just happen at the studio. It happened during karate competitions, when Doucette would take Jodie to hotels out of town. It happened in motels. It happened in places where other people were nearby, but had no idea what was going on behind closed doors. One time, Gary's brother saw Doucette kiss Jodie on the mouth after a competition in Dallas. He told Gary about it. Gary didn't believe him. Gary thought Doucette was just being affectionate in a friendly way. He trusted Doucette. Jodie's behavior started to change during this time, but nobody understood why. He began making excuses about why he didn't want to go to karate practice. He would say he wasn't feeling well, or that he had too much homework, or that he just didn't feel like going. But Doucette would show up at the house anyway and insist on taking him. June let him go because she thought coaches knew what was best for their students. She thought Jodie was just being lazy or unmotivated. She had no idea what was really happening. Doucette also convinced Jodie to quit all his other sports. Jodie had been playing soccer, football, softball, and basketball. He loved being active and playing with his friends on different teams. But Doucette told him that if he wanted to get really good at karate, he needed to focus only on karate. He needed to stop spreading himself thin across so many activities. Jodie listened to him. He dropped his other sports. Looking back as an adult, Jodie understood that this was part of Doucette's plan. By making Jodie quit his other activities, Doucette made sure he had more time alone with Jodie. He isolated him. He cut him off from other adults and other environments where someone might notice something was wrong. The saddest part of all of this is that Jodie genuinely believed Jeff Doucette was his friend. He looked up to him. He admired him. He wanted to make him proud. Doucette took him to movies. He took him out to eat. He bought him things. He gave him attention. To a young boy whose parents were going through a divorce, whose father had moved out of the house, Doucette seemed like someone who really cared. That's what makes this kind of abuse so devastating. The abuser doesn't present themselves as a monster. They present themselves as someone kind, someone helpful, someone trustworthy. And then they use that trust to hurt the child in ways that will stay with them for the rest of their lives. By late 1983 and early 1984, Plauché had completely inserted himself into the Plauché family's life. He was at their house all the time. He was involved in every aspect of their routine. He had become someone they depended on, and he was using that position to abuse Jody almost daily. Nobody in the family had any idea. To them, Jeff Doucette was a blessing, a young man who cared about their kids, a coach who was helping their son excel, a friend who was there for them during a difficult time. But the reality was that Jeff Doucette was a predator. He had admitted to police that he had done this before, to other boys, in other places. He was good at it because he had been doing it for years, and now he had worked his way so deep into the Plauché family that Jody felt he had no way out. Jody was trapped, and it was about to get much, much worse. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 3. The Kidnapping. 10 days gone. The winter of 1983 rolled into early 1984. Jeff Doucette had been abusing Jody for almost a year, but now Doucette was facing a different kind of problem, one that had nothing to do with Jody. Section 2. The checks around Baton Rouge. He owed people money. He had racked up debt that he couldn't pay, and he had a court date coming up where he would have to answer for those bad checks. Doucette knew he was in trouble. He knew that if he showed up to that court date, there would be consequences, so he made a decision. He decided to run, and when he ran, he decided to take Jody with him. It was Sunday, February 19th, 1984. Jody was home with his family in Baton Rouge. It was a normal weekend day. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then Jeff Doucette showed up at the house. His brother had dropped him off. Doucette came to the door and asked to speak to June. He told her a story. He said his brother had to leave right away. He said his father was helping build a new home for the family of one of his other karate students. The family needed carpets installed, and Doucette's brother did carpet installation work. Doucette said he needed to borrow June's car to help with the carpet work, and he asked if Jody could come with him to help. June agreed, but she had one condition. She told Doucette that he had to bring Jody back by the end of the day. She told them both not to stay out too long. Doucette promised her. He assured her they would be back before nightfall. He looked her in the eye and made that promise. Then he and Jody got in June's car and drove away. But Doucette had no intention of bringing Jody back that evening, or the next day, or any time soon. As they drove, Jody started to feel like something wasn't right. They weren't going to install carpets, they were going somewhere else. Doucette's first stop was his brother's house in Gonzales, Louisiana, which is about 24 miles southeast of Baton Rouge. Doucette went inside and grabbed some of his belongings. Then they got back in the car and kept driving. The next stop was Port Arthur, Texas, where Doucette's mother still lived. This was the small city right on the Louisiana-Texas border where Doucette had been born. They arrived at his mother's house. Doucette told his mother that he and Jody were heading to New York. He asked her for money. He told her that they would be dropping Jody off in Baton Rouge on the way, since it would be along the route. His mother believed him. She gave him money. She even called June to reassure her that Jody was safe. The next day, February 20th, Doucette and Jody drove to Vinton, Louisiana, which is another small town right across the river from Port Arthur. They went to Doucette's uncle's house. Doucette borrowed more money from his uncle, telling him the same story about going to New York and dropping Jody off along the way. With the borrowed money, Doucette bought 2 bus tickets, but they weren't going to New York, and they weren't going back to Baton Rouge. They were going to Los Angeles, California. It was a 2,000-mile journey from the Texas-Louisiana border to Los Angeles. The bus ride took them through Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona before finally reaching California. For Jody, who was 11 years old, it was a long, confusing trip. He didn't fully understand what was happening. He knew this wasn't normal. He knew his mother would be worried. But Doucette was the adult, and Jody had been conditioned over the past year to do what Doucette told him to do. When they finally arrived in Los Angeles, they stayed the first night in the city. The next day, They took another bus to Anaheim, which is about 25 Fracture Point, Jeff Angeles. Anaheim is famous for one thing: Disneyland. Doucette checked them into a cheap motel called the Samoa Motel. It was close to Disneyland, close enough that they could walk there. The motel room was number 38. Once they were settled in the motel, Doucette did something to change Jodie's appearance. He went out and bought hair dye. Jodie had bright blonde hair, what people sometimes call cotton top hair. Doucette dyed it black. He was trying to make Jodie look different so that if anyone was looking for them, they wouldn't recognise the boy. Doucette also shaved off his own beard. He was trying to disguise himself too. He told people that Jodie was his son, and for the next several days they stayed in that motel room near Disneyland. What happened in that room over those days was horrific. Doucette continued to sexually assault Jodie. The abuse that had been happening for a year back in Baton Rouge didn't stop, it got worse. Jodie was 2,000 miles from home, in a motel room with no one to help him, with a man who had complete control over him. Law enforcement started investigating. The FBI got involved because Doucette had taken Jodie across state lines, which made it a federal kidnapping case. Gary and June had no idea where their son was. They didn't know if he was safe. They didn't know if they would ever see him again. Then, 1 week after Doucette had taken Jodie, something happened that would crack the case wide open. It was Sunday, February 26, 1984. June received a collect call at home. It was Jodie. He told her he was safe. That's all she needed to hear in that moment. Her son was alive. But June didn't know where the call was coming from. At first, based on what Doucette had told his mother, everyone thought they might be in New York. But Doucette had been lying. Over the next few days, Doucette allowed Jodie to call home a few more times. On one of those calls, Jodie and June talked for 22 minutes. It was a long conversation. June was desperate to know where he was, if he was okay, when he was coming home. Jodie couldn't tell her everything. Doucette was right there in the room with him. What Doucette didn't know was that the FBI had done something very important as soon as Jodie was reported missing. They had set up a wiretap on June's home phone. A wiretap is when law enforcement puts special equipment on a phone line so they can listen to calls coming in and going out. It's used to try to find kidnappers or criminals. So when Jodie called home, the FBI wasn't just hearing June's side of the conversation, they were hearing everything. And more importantly, they could trace where the call was coming from. A deputy sheriff from Baton Rouge was listening to one of those calls. When Jodie called collect, the sheriff's deputy knew this was their chance. As soon as the call ended, the deputy grabbed the phone and demanded that the telephone operator tell him exactly where the call had come from. The operator told the deputy the location. The deputy told her this was a kidnapping case. The operator gave him the address. Within minutes, the call had been traced to the Samoa Motel in Anaheim, California, room 38. The Anaheim police and FBI agents responded immediately. They rushed to the motel. On February 29, 1984, they broke down the door of room 38. Jodie was inside watching television. Suddenly there were guns everywhere. FBI agents swarmed into the room. Jodie later remembered seeing all the guns pointed at him and being pulled out of the room. That was the last time he saw Jeff Doucette. The police arrested Doucette without incident. He didn't fight, he didn't resist. He was taken into custody and charged with aggravated kidnapping. The word aggravated, in legal terms, means the kidnapping was made worse by other factors, like taking someone across state lines or hurting them during the kidnapping. For Jodie, what happened next was confusing and traumatic in a different way. The police took him to the police station and questioned him. They treated him, Jodie later said, almost like he was a suspect instead of a victim. They needed to understand what had happened. They needed to know what Doucette had done. Then Jodie was taken to a hospital. At the hospital, they performed what's called a rape kit. This is a medical examination where doctors collect evidence that can prove someone was sexually assaulted. It's not a pleasant process. For Jodie, who had just been rescued from a kidnapping, who had been abused for a year, who was only 11 years old, it was another layer of trauma. The rape kit confirmed what investigators suspected. Jodie had been heavily sexually abused by Doucette. After the hospital, Section 2, the place called the Albert Sutton Home, which was a facility for abused and neglected children. He stayed there for the day while arrangements were made to get him home. On March 1st, 1984, at around 1 in the morning, Jody flew out of California. He flew back to Louisiana. He flew back to his family. He had been gone for 10 days. For a child, 10 days away from home in those circumstances must have felt like a lifetime. When Jody got back to Baton Rouge and was reunited with his parents, there were a lot of complicated emotions. He was relieved to be home. His parents were relieved to have him back. But now the truth was coming out, the full truth. Jody's parents were learning not just that Plauché had kidnapped their son, but that Plauché had been sexually abusing Jody for almost a year before the kidnapping. This wasn't a sudden crime. This had been happening right under their noses for months and months. The grooming, the abuse at the karate studio, the trips out of town, all of it. Jody started talking to his mother about what had happened. He told her some details, but not everything. He asked her not to tell his father everything. He was scared of how Gary would react. He knew his father had always said he would kill anyone who hurt his kids. But June felt that Gary deserved to know the truth. Gary was Jody's father. So June started telling Gary some of the things Jody had shared with her. Each detail she told him pushed Gary further and further toward the edge. Meanwhile, Jeff Doucette was being held in California while authorities worked out the legal process to bring him back to Louisiana. When someone is arrested in one state for a crime that happened in another state, there's a process called extradition. Extradition is when one state asks another state to send the person back so they can face trial. Louisiana wanted Doucette back so he could stand trial for what he had done to Jody. During his time in custody in California, Doucette reportedly confessed some things to the officers who were transporting him. He told them that Jody hadn't been his only victim. He claimed he had abused other young boys over the years. He said he couldn't even remember how many or all of their identities. This was not a man who had made one terrible mistake. This was a predator who had been hurting children for a long time. On March 16, 1984, 2 weeks after Jody had been rescued, Jeff Doucette was flown back to Louisiana to face trial for aggravated kidnapping and sexual assault. The plan was to bring him through Baton Rouge Metropolitan Airport, process him through the system, and get him ready for his day in court. What nobody knew was that Gary Plauché had found out exactly when Doucette would be arriving at that airport, and Gary had decided that Jeff Doucette would never make it to a courtroom. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 4. Discovery and Rescue. The call that changed everything. Jody had been gone for 10 full days when the phone call came through. It was Wednesday, February 29th, 1984. February 29th only happens every 4 years during what's called a leap year, when an extra day is added to the calendar. Jody later remembered this detail because when Doucette was arrested, his police photo had the date stamped on it, February 29th. That date would be burned into the family's memory forever. June was at home in Baton Rouge when the phone rang. She picked it up. It was a collect call. A collect call is when the person calling doesn't pay for the call. Instead, the person receiving the call agrees to pay the charges. The operator came on the line and asked June if she would accept a collect call. June said yes. Then she heard her son's voice. Jody told her he was safe. He told her he was in California. For June, just hearing his voice was everything. Her son was alive. He had been missing for 10 days. 10 days of not knowing where he was, if he was hurt, if she would ever see him again. And now she was hearing his voice on the phone. He was in California, thousands of miles away, but he was alive. They talked for a minute or so. Then the voice on the phone changed. It was Jeff Doucette. He started talking to June directly. He told her to gather her other 3 children and meet him the following morning in California. He wanted the whole family to come channel tremendously. June tried to reason with him. She told him that Gary, her ex-husband, might try to use the fact that Doucette had taken Jody out of state to get custody of all the kids. This was something the police had coached her to say. It was a reason Doucette might believe for bringing Jody back. June was desperate. She would have said anything to get her son home safely. Finally, she agreed to what Doucette was asking. She told him she would come to California with the other children. She just needed him to tell her where they were. Doucette seemed satisfied with her answer. Then he hung up the phone. What Jeff Doucette didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The FBI had been involved in this case from the moment Jody was reported missing, because Doucette had taken Jody across state lines, from Louisiana to Texas to California. This wasn't just a local police matter, it was a federal case. Kidnapping someone and taking them to another state is a federal crime. So the FBI had gotten involved immediately, and one of the first things the FBI did was put a wiretap on June's home phone. A wiretap is a piece of equipment that law enforcement can attach to a phone line when they have permission from a judge. It lets them listen to phone calls coming in and going out. The purpose is to try to find criminals or rescue victims. In this case, the FBI knew that if Doucette called, if Jody called, they needed to be able to trace that call and find out where it was coming from. So they had set up the wiretap on June's phone, and they had been waiting. When the phone rang on February 29th, and June accepted that collect call, a Baton Rouge deputy sheriff was listening to every single word of the conversation. He heard Jody's voice. He heard Doucette's voice. He heard Doucette telling June to come to California, and as soon as the call ended, that deputy sheriff grabbed the phone line and contacted the telephone operator. He told the operator this was a kidnapping case. He demanded to know exactly where that collect call had come from. The operator didn't hesitate. She gave him the information. The call had come from the Samoa Motel in Anaheim, California, room 38. Within minutes, that information was passed to the Anaheim Police Department and the FBI. They now knew exactly where Jody was. They knew exactly where Jeff Doucette was, and they moved fast. The Anaheim police and FBI agents rushed to the Samoa Motel. They surrounded room 38. Then, they broke down the door. Jody was inside the room watching television. Suddenly, there were armed police officers and FBI agents everywhere. Guns were drawn. Jody looked up and saw guns pointed in every direction. He later remembered thinking, all the guns were in my face. The officers grabbed him and pulled him out of the room. That was the last time Jody ever saw Jeff Doucette in person. The police arrested Doucette right there in the motel room. He didn't fight, he didn't try to run, he didn't resist, he just let them arrest him. The police put him in handcuffs and took him into custody. He was charged with aggravated kidnapping, which means kidnapping that's made worse by additional factors, like taking someone across state lines or hurting them. For Jody, being rescued should have been a moment of pure relief, but it wasn't that simple. He was 11 years old. He had been with Doucette for 10 days. Before that, Doucette had been abusing him for nearly a year. Jody's mind was confused. Part of him was relieved to be safe. Part of him still saw Doucette as a friend, as someone he cared about. That's what abuse does to a child. It twists up their feelings so they don't know what to think or how to feel. The police didn't just rescue Jody and send him straight home. They had a process they needed to follow. First, they took Jody to the police station. There, they questioned him. They needed to understand what had happened. They needed to know where Doucette had taken him, what Doucette had done to him, how long they had been in California. Jody later said that the way the police questioned him felt like they were treating him like a suspect instead of like a victim. They asked him question after question. It was overwhelming for a child who had just been through such a terrible experience. After the police station, Jody was taken to a hospital. At the hospital, doctors performed what's called a rape kit. A rape kit is a medical examination where doctors collect evidence that can prove someone was sexually assaulted. They look for injuries. They collect samples that can be tested in a laboratory. It's an important step for law enforcement because it provides proof of what happened. But for the victim, especially for a child, it's not a pleasant experience. It's invasive, it's uncomfortable, it's scary. Jody had just been rescued from a kidnapping. He had been sexually abused for nearly a year, and now he had to go through a medical examination that forced him to relive what had happened to him. But the rape kit served its purpose. The test results confirmed what investigators already suspected. Jody had been heavily sexually abused by Jeff Doucette. The evidence was there. Analysis. Please consider there would be no question about what Doucette had done. After the hospital, Jody couldn't just go home yet. The police took him to a place called the Albert Sutton Home. This was a facility in California for children who had been abused or neglected. It was a safe place where Jody could stay while the authorities made arrangements to get him back to Louisiana. He spent the day there. Then, early in the morning on March 1st, 1984, Jody finally got on a plane. The flight left California at around 1 in the morning. Jody flew through the night and landed back in Louisiana. He had been gone for 10 days. Now he was finally going home. When Jody arrived back in Baton Rouge and was reunited with his parents, there were so many emotions happening all at once. Gary and June were incredibly relieved to have their son back. Jody was relieved to be home, but there was also confusion, fear, shame and anger swirling around in everyone's minds. Because now, the truth was coming out. Not just the truth about the kidnapping, but the truth about everything that had been happening for the past year. Gary and June were learning that Jeff Doucette hadn't just suddenly kidnapped their son. He had been sexually abusing Jody for almost a year before the kidnapping ever happened. All those karate lessons, all those trips, all those times Doucette had been at their house, playing games with the family, eating dinner with them, being treated like a friend. During all of that time, he had been hurting their son. And they hadn't known. They hadn't seen it. They hadn't protected Jody from it. In the days after Jody came home, he started opening up to his mother about what had happened. Not everything. He couldn't tell her everything. It was too much. It was too painful. But he told her some things, some of the details about what Doucette had done to him, and he asked her not to tell his father. Jody was terrified of how Gary would react. He had heard his father say for years, "If anyone ever touches my kid, I'll kill them." Jody knew his father wasn't joking when he said that. Jody didn't want his father to do something that would land him in jail. The family had already been through so much. Jody didn't want to be responsible for his father going to prison. But June felt differently. She felt that Gary had a right to know the truth. Gary was Jody's father. He deserved to know what had been done to his son. So even though Jody had asked her not to tell, June started sharing some of the details with Gary. She told him about the abuse. She told him how long it had been going on. She told him what Doucette had done to their 11-year-old boy. With every detail June told him, Gary became more and more angry, more and more devastated, more and more convinced that the justice system wouldn't be enough, that no prison sentence could ever be enough punishment for what Doucette had done. Meanwhile, Jeff Doucette was still in California. He was being held in custody while the legal process moved forward. There's a procedure in the United States legal system called extradition. Extradition is when someone is arrested in one state for a crime that happened in another state, and the state where the crime happened asks to have that person sent back so they can face trial. Louisiana wanted Doucette brought back to Baton Rouge to stand trial for kidnapping and sexually assaulting Jody. So the state of Louisiana filed for extradition. While he was in custody in California, waiting to be extradited, Doucette was being transported between locations by law enforcement officers. During these transports, Doucette reportedly said some things to the officers that made this case even more disturbing. He told them that Jody wasn't his only victim. He admitted that over the years, he had sexually abused other young boys. He said he couldn't even remember how many boys there had been, or all of their names. This wasn't a man who had made one terrible mistake. This was a man who had been hurting children for years, possibly for most of his adult life. The officers who heard these confessions documented them, but Doucette would never face trial for those other crimes. He would never even make it to trial for what he did to Jody. On March 16, 1984, 2 weeks after Jody had been rescued from that motel room in Anaheim, Jeff Doucette was put on a plane. He was being flown back to Louisiana. The plan was simple. Bring Doucette through Baton Rouge Metropolitan Airport, process him into the local jail system, and prepare him for his trial. News stations in Baton Rouge knew Doucette was coming. This was a big story. A local karate instructor had kidnapped a child and taken him across the country. Everyone in Baton Rouge knew about it. So the local ABC news station, WBRZ, decided to send a camera crew to the airport to film Doucette's arrival. They wanted footage of him being escorted through the airport in handcuffs. They wanted to show the community that this predator had been caught and was being brought to justice. What the station knew was that they were about to capture something much more dramatic than a simple arrival, because Gary Plauché had also... On a warm evening in early 19, Doucette would be arriving at that airport, and Gary had decided that Jeff Doucette would never make it to a courtroom. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 5. Gary's breaking point. Planning the unthinkable. In the days after Jody came home, Gary Plauché was not doing well. On the outside, he might have looked like a man who was relieved his son was back safe, but on the inside, Gary was falling apart. Every time June told him another detail about what Doucette had done to Jody, it was like a wound opening up deeper and deeper. The abuse hadn't been a one-time thing. It had been happening for almost a year, nearly every day, sometimes twice a day. In the back room of the karate studio, in hotel rooms during competitions, in motels. And Gary hadn't known. He hadn't seen it. He hadn't protected his son. That feeling of helplessness, that feeling of having failed as a father was eating him alive. Gary gave an interview to a local news crew shortly after Jody was returned home. In the interview, he spoke calmly about the family's fear and worry while Jody was missing. The reporter asked him if he had learned anything from the experience. Gary's answer was simple and quiet. "I guess just how much I love my children," he said. To anyone watching that interview, Gary looked like a man who was holding it together. But underneath that calm surface, something was building, a rage that was growing stronger with every passing day. Gary started spending a lot of time at a local bar called the Cotton Club. It was the kind of place where regulars went to have an ordinary world. A family in Baton Rouge. Long day. Gary had always been a social person. He was known around Baton Rouge as someone who made people laugh, someone who was fun to be around. But now, when he sat at the Cotton Club, he wasn't there to have a good time. He was there asking the same question over and over again to anyone who would listen. "When do you think they'll bring Doucette back to Baton Rouge for trial?" he kept asking. He wanted to know when Jeff Doucette would be brought back from California. He wanted to know when Doucette would be in Baton Rouge. He wanted to know the exact date, the exact time. Gary had worked in television before. Years earlier, he had worked part-time as a cameraman for WBRZ, the local A. The oldest was Rouge. He knew people who worked there. Some of them were his friends. Some of them he drank with regularly at the Cotton Club. And on March 16, 1984, one of those friends gave Gary the information he had been looking for. Gary was at the Cotton Club that day, having a drink. An executive from WBRZ happened to be there. Gary struck up a conversation with him. The executive told Gary that Jeff Doucette was being flown back to Louisiana that very night. He was arriving at Baton Rouge Metropolitan Airport. The executive even told Gary the specific time. The flight was scheduled to land at 9:08 in the evening. Jeff Doucette would be walking through that airport in just a few hours. Gary finished his drink. He left the Cotton Club. He went and got his gun. It was a .38 caliber revolver. A revolver is a type of handgun that has a rotating cylinder that holds the bullets. Gary tucked that gun into his boot so nobody would see it. Then he put on a white baseball cap and a pair of dark sunglasses to hide his face, and he drove to Baton Rouge Metropolitan Airport. Jody later told reporters that his father went to the airport that night, believing he was going to die. Gary had told people close to him, "Either Jeff or me is going to die tonight." Gary thought that after he shot Doucette, the police would probably shoot him, or that he would be sent to prison for the rest of his life. But he didn't care anymore. In his mind, Jeff Doucette had destroyed his son's childhood. Doucette had hurt Jody in ways that could never be undone, and Gary believed that no prison sentence, no trial, no punishment from the courts would ever be enough for what Doucette had done. So Gary decided he would deliver his own punishment. When Gary arrived at the airport, it was evening. In 1984, airport security was very different than it is today. People could walk right up to the gates where passengers got off planes. You didn't have to go through metal detectors or show identification. You could just walk in and go wherever you wanted in the airport. Family members would often meet their loved ones right at the gate when they got off the plane, so Gary was able to walk into the arrivals hall without anyone stopping him. The airport wasn't empty. There were people walking around, there were passengers coming and going, and there was a news crew from WBRZ setting up their cameras. The news crew knew that Jeff Doucette was being flown back from California to face charges. This was a big story in Baton Rouge, A local karate instructor had kidnapped a child and taken him all the way to California. Everyone in the community knew about it, so WBRZ wanted footage of Doucette being brought back in handcuffs. They wanted to show the people of Baton Rouge that this man was being brought to justice. Gary saw the news cameras setting up. He saw where they were positioning themselves, and he positioned himself opposite them, near a row of payphones. He picked up one of the phones and called his best friend. His friend answered. Gary started talking to him, but he kept his back turned to the rest of the airport. He kept watching, waiting. The sunglasses and baseball cap helped hide his face, but Gary also knew that some of the police officers in the airport might recognize him. His son's case had been all over the news. Gary's face had been on television. So he stayed on the phone, acting like he was just a normal person making a call, hoping that nobody would look at him too closely. At around 9:30 in the evening, Jeff Doucette's plane landed. He was taken off the plane by law enforcement officers. 2 East Baton Rouge Parish Sheriff's deputies had flown to California to escort Doucette back to Louisiana. Now they were walking him through the airport. Doucette was in handcuffs. His hands were cuffed behind his back. An armed police officer walked right next to him. Doucette looked calm. He didn't look worried or scared. He walked through the airport like he didn't have a care in the world. He had no idea that just a few feet away, Gary Plauché was standing at a payphone with a gun hidden in his boot. As Doucette and the officers walked through the arrivals hall, they passed right by the WBRZ news crew. The cameras were rolling. The bright lights from the camera crew lit up the area. Doucette walked past them. The cameras followed him, and Gary, standing at the payphone, could see the reflection of those camera lights on the wall. He could see exactly where Doucette was, based on where the lights were shining. Gary spoke quietly into the phone to his friend. "Here he comes," Gary said. "You're about to hear a shot." Then Gary hung up the phone. He reached down and pulled the .38 revolver out of his boot. He spun around, and there was Jeff Doucette, just a few feet away from him, walking past in handcuffs with a police officer right beside him. Gary raised the gun. He aimed it at the right side of Doucette's head, and he fired. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the airport. Doucette immediately collapsed to the floor. Blood poured from a wound near his right ear. The bullet had gone straight into his brain. People in the airport started screaming. Some people hit the ground, others ran. The news cameras captured everything. The shooter, the victim falling, the chaos that erupted in that moment. The WBRZ crew got it all on tape. The police officer's family in Baton Rouge acted instantly. One officer rushed to Doucette, who was lying on the floor bleeding. The other officers grabbed Gary. They wrestled him against the bank of payphones and pinned him there. Gary calmly placed the telephone receiver back on the hook with one hand. Then the officers pulled the gun out of his other hand. As they held him against the wall, the officers realized who they had just grabbed. One of the officers was Deputy Mike Barnett. Barnett was a major in the Baton Rouge Sheriff's Department. He had been one of the lead investigators on Jodi's kidnapping case. He had flown to California to help bring Doucette back, and Barnett knew Gary Plauché personally. They were friends. They had gone to school together years earlier. Barnett couldn't believe what had just from Mayfair Elementary School Gary and asked him a question that would become famous. The words were caught on the news cameras. "Gary, why?" Barnett said. "Why, Gary?" Gary's answer was simple and direct. "If somebody did it to your kid, you'd do it too," he said. Jeff Doucette lay on the airport floor in a pool of blood. The bullet had caused massive damage to his brain. Emergency medical workers arrived and rushed him to a hospital, but there was nothing they could do to save him. Doucette fell into a coma. He died the next day, on March 17, 1984. He was 25 years old. Gary Plauché was immediately arrested. The officers took him into custody and charged him with second-degree murder. Second-degree murder is when someone kills another person on purpose, but without planning it ahead of time. However, Gary had very clearly planned this. He had asked around to find out when Doucette was arriving. He had gotten the exact time from a news executive. He had brought a gun. He had hidden his face. He had positioned himself near the payphones where he knew Doucette would walk past. This was not a sudden decision made in the heat of the moment. This was something Gary had thought about and prepared for. The footage from the WBRZ news cameras spread quickly. This was 1984, long before the internet or social media, but the video was shocking enough that news stations across the country wanted to show it. Americans watched the footage on their television screens. They saw Gary Plauché spin around and shoot Jeff Doucet in the head at point-blank range. They saw Doucet fall. They saw the police tackle Gary. They heard Deputy Barnett asking, "Why, Gary? Why?" And the whole country started debating the same question. Was Gary Plauché a murderer, or was he a father who did what any father would do? While Gary sat in jail, the people of Baton Rouge were making up their minds, and most of them had already decided. Gary Plauché was a hero. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 6. Public reaction. A community rallies behind Gary. The video of Gary Plauché shooting Jeff Doucet spread across the country within hours. Television stations from coast to coast played the footage on the evening news. Americans watched Gary spin around from the payphone, raise his gun, and fire a single shot into Doucet's head at point-blank range. They saw Doucet collapse to the ground. They saw the police tackle Gary and pin him against the wall. And they heard Deputy Mike Barnett asking, "Why, Gary? Why?" The footage was shocking. It was violent. It was disturbing. But to many people who watched it, Gary Plauché wasn't a criminal. He was a hero. In Baton Rouge, the public reaction to what Gary had done was overwhelming. People didn't think Gary should be in jail. They thought he had done exactly what needed to be done. A journalist named Art Harris wrote about the case for the Washington Post shortly after the shooting. He described how the people of Baton Rouge had already made up their minds about Gary's guilt or innocence. Harris wrote that the locals had already acquitted him, meaning they had already decided he was not guilty, even before any trial happened. From strangers on the street to the regular customers at the Cotton Club, where Gary used to drink Miller Lite beers, everyone seemed to agree Gary Plauché had done the right thing. One of those locals was a man named Murray Curry, who worked as a riverboat captain. Curry told reporters that Gary was anything but a killer. "He's a father who done it out of love for his child and for his pride," Curry said. Curry, like many other people in Baton Rouge, felt that Gary had been pushed to do something extreme because of the extreme circumstances. Your child being kidnapped and sexually assaulted for nearly a year would drive any parent to the edge. And in the minds of most people in Baton Rouge, Jeff Doucet had gotten exactly what he deserved. Support for Gary wasn't just people talking about him in bars or on street corners. People took action to help him. Gary had been arrested and charged with second-degree murder. His bail was set at $100,000. Bail is money that someone accused of a crime has to pay to get out of jail while they wait for their trial. It's a huge amount of money. Most families don't have $100,000 just sitting around. But the people of Baton Rouge wanted to help Gary's family, so they started a defense fund. A defense fund is money that people donate to help pay for someone's legal costs. In Gary, one of the boys brought home a flyer to pay his bail so he could get out of jail. It would also help pay for lawyers to defend him in court, and it would help support his family while Gary was dealing with the legal system. People from all over Baton Rouge donated money to the fund. Murray Curry donated. Strangers donated. People who had never met Gary Plauché, but who had heard his story, donated. Within a short time, hundreds of phone calls came in. Hundreds of donations poured in. People wanted to help this father, who had taken justice into his own hands. The defense fund raised enough money Jeffrey Paul $2,000 bail and help his family stay afloat financially during the long legal process ahead. While all of this support was building in Baton Rouge, Gary was sitting in jail. He had been arrested immediately after the shooting and taken into custody. He was charged with second-degree murder, which is a very serious crime. If he was convicted, he could spend the rest of his life in prison. But Gary's legal team had a plan. They weren't going to argue that Gary didn't kill Jeff Doucet. Obviously he did. It was caught on camera. Millions of people had seen the video. There was no question about whether Gary had pulled the trigger. The question was whether Gary should be held responsible for his actions, in the same way that someone who commits a normal murder would be held responsible. Gary's defense team was going to argue that Gary had been in a very specific mental state when he killed Doucet. They were going to argue that Gary had suffered a mental breakdown After Jody came home from California, Gary had learned the full extent of what Doucette had done in the ordinary world. He learned that the abuse had been going on for nearly a year. He learned that it happened almost every day. He learned the details of what took place in that karate studio, in those hotel rooms, in that motel in California. Every detail that Gary learned pushed him further toward the edge of sanity. Mike Barnett, the deputy sheriff who had been one of Gary's friends and who had been escorting Doucette through the airport, later told people about Gary's reaction when he first learned what Doucette had done. Barnett said that Gary had the same reaction most parents do when they find out their children have been raped or molested. He was horrified. According to people who were close to Gary during this time, he had two brothers walked into their first kill that SOB. Gary wasn't hiding his intentions. He was telling people, at least people he was close to, that he wanted Doucette dead. A psychiatrist named Dr. Edward P. Uzzi was brought in to examine Gary. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor who specializes in mental health and mental illness. Dr. Uzzi's job was to evaluate Gary's mental state at the time of the shooting. After examining Gary and talking with him extensively, Dr. Uzzi came to a conclusion. He determined that when Gary killed Doucette, Gary could not tell the difference between right and wrong. This is an important legal concept. In order to be found guilty of murder, a person has to know that what they're doing is wrong. Louisiana. If a person is so mentally disturbed that they genuinely cannot understand that killing someone is wrong, then they might not be held fully responsible. Their mother had signed them up after the same way. Dr. Uzzi said that Gary had been driven into what he called a temporarily psychotic state because of the extreme trauma of learning about the abuse his son had suffered. In other words, Gary's mind had essentially broken under the weight of what he had learned. He had developed what Dr. Uzzi described as delusions. A delusion is a false belief that someone holds even when there's evidence that it's not true. Dr. Uzzi said that Gary had come to believe that he was the only person in the world who could save his son and society from Jeff Doucette. Gary believed that if he didn't kill Doucette, Doucette would continue to harm Jody and would go on to hurt other children. Gary felt like it was his mission, his responsibility, to stop Doucette permanently. And according to Dr. Uzzi, Gary heard what he thought was the voice of Jesus telling him to do it. Dr. Uzzi also looked at Jeff Doucette's behaviour and how it had affected the Plauché family. He determined that Doucette had been extremely good at manipulating people. Doucette had taken advantage of the fact that Gary and June were separated and going through a divorce. When Gary moved out of the house, Doucette moved in emotionally. He filled the gap that Gary had left. He became the father figure. He became the trusted friend. He wedged his way so deeply into the family that by the time anyone realised what was happening, it was too late. Jody had already been abused for months. This manipulation, Dr. Uzzi said, had contributed to Gary's mental breakdown. Gary felt like he had been fooled. He felt like he had failed to protect his son. And those feelings of guilt and rage had pushed him over the edge. Gary's defence team used all of this information to argue that Gary should not be convicted of murder. They pointed to the extreme circumstances. They pointed to the psychiatric evaluation. They pointed to the fact that Gary had no history of violence. He had never hurt anyone before. He wasn't a dangerous person. He was a regular guy. A salesman. A father. Someone who loved his kids and would do anything to protect them. The defence team argued that Gary posed no threat to society. He wasn't going to go out and shoot random people. He had shot one specific person who had done something unspeakable to his child. He would never do anything like this again. And they were right about one thing. The overwhelming public support for Gary showed that the community didn't see him as a threat. They saw him as someone who had been put in an impossible situation and had reacted the way many fathers would have wanted to react. Meanwhile, the case was moving through the legal system. Gary was initially charged with second-degree murder, but there was a problem with that charge from the perspective of the legal system. It would be very difficult to get a jury in Baton Rouge to convict Gary of murder. Everyone in town supported him. If the case went to trial with a local jury, there was a very real chance that the jury would find Gary not guilty, no matter what the evidence showed. The footage was clear. Gary had planned the killing. He had gotten the gun. He had gone to the airport. He had positioned himself. He had waited for Doucette to walk by. This was premeditated, meaning he had thought about it and planned it ahead of time. In legal terms, that's usually first-degree murder, which is the most serious kind. But the people of Baton Rouge didn't care about those legal details. They cared about the fact that Jeff Doucette had hurt a child, and Gary Plauché had stopped him from ever hurting anyone again. So the legal system did what it often does in complicated cases like this. The prosecution and the defense worked out a deal. It's called a plea bargain. A plea bargain is when the person accused of a crime agrees to plead guilty, or no contest, to a lesser charge in exchange for a lighter sentence. In Gary's case, the charge was reduced from second-degree murder to manslaughter. Manslaughter is when someone kills another person, but without planning it ahead of time, or in circumstances that make it less serious than murder. It carries a lighter punishment. Gary agreed to plead no contest to the manslaughter charge. Pleading no contest means Gary wasn't saying he was guilty, but he also wasn't saying he was innocent. He was just accepting the conviction without admitting to the crime. This is an important distinction, because if Gary had pleaded guilty, that admission could have been used against him later in other legal situations, like if Doucette's family had tried to sue him. Now it was up to the judge to decide what Gary's punishment would be. The judge in the case was named Frank Sire. Judge Sire had a lot of factors to consider. On one hand, Gary had killed someone. He had taken the law into his own hands. He had shot an unarmed man who was in police custody and in handcuffs. That goes against everything the justice system is supposed to stand for. The justice system is supposed to handle criminals. People aren't supposed to just shoot people they think deserve to die, no matter what those people have done. If the judge let Gary off too easy, it could send a message that vigilante justice is acceptable, that taking the law into your own hands is okay. On the other hand, Judge Sire had to consider the extreme circumstances of what Gary had gone through. His son had been sexually abused for nearly a year. His son had been kidnapped and taken across the country. The abuse had been proven by medical tests. Jeff Doucette had confessed to having abused other boys in the past, and Gary had clearly suffered a mental breakdown because of all of this. Judge Sire also had to consider public opinion. The entire community of Baton Rouge supported Gary. Hundreds of people had donated money to help him. If the judge sent Gary to prison for the rest of his life, it would be very unpopular. It might even cause problems in the community. Judge Sire made his decision, and it was a decision that would be talked about for decades to come. Section 7. The sentencing. Justice or mercy? On August 27, 1985, over a year after Gary Plauché shot Jeff Doucette at the Baton Rouge airport, Judge Frank Sire stood in his courtroom and prepared to announce Gary's sentence. The courtroom was packed. People from all over Baton Rouge had come to see what would happen to the man who had become both famous and controversial. Gary had already pleaded no contest to manslaughter several months earlier. Now it was time to find out what his punishment would be. The charge of manslaughter could carry a maximum sentence of 21 years in prison. Gary could have been locked up for more than 2 decades. But everyone in that courtroom knew that the circumstances of this case were not normal. This wasn't a regular murder case, and Judge Sire's decision would reflect that. Judge Sire began by making a statement that would be quoted in newspapers across the country. In this case, Judge Sire said, the defendant's family was punished before the criminal act took place. What Judge Sire meant was simple. Gary Plauché and his family had already suffered. They had suffered when Jody was being abused for nearly a year without anyone knowing. They had suffered when Jody was kidnapped and taken across the country. They had suffered when Jody was held in a motel and abused even more. The family had been through hell long before Gary ever pulled that trigger. Judge Sire was acknowledging that the Plauché family were victims first. Then Gary became a criminal. But the order of those events mattered. Judge Sire went on to explain his reasoning. He said that there was virtually no risk that Gary would commit another crime. Gary had no history of violence. He had never hurt anyone before this. He wasn't a dangerous person who would go out and shoot random people. He had shot one specific person who had done something horrible to his child. Judge Sire also said that sending Gary to prison would not help anyone. It wouldn't bring Jeff Doucette back. It wouldn't undo the trauma that Jody had experienced. It wouldn't make the community safer because Gary wasn't a threat to the community. and it wouldn't serve any useful purpose to lock Gary up for years and years. Finally, Judge Sire said that giving Gary probation instead of prison time would not take away from the seriousness of the crime. In other words, just because Gary wasn't going to prison didn't mean that what he did was okay. It didn't mean that vigilante justice was acceptable. It just meant that in this specific case, with these specific circumstances, prison wasn't the right answer. Then Judge Sire announced the sentence. Gary Plauché would receive a 7-year suspended sentence. A suspended sentence means that the prison time is given but then held back. Gary wouldn't have to actually go to prison as long as he followed certain rules. Those rules were part of his probation. Probation is a period of time when someone who has been convicted of a crime has to follow specific conditions instead of going to jail. Gary was given 5 years of probation. During those 5 years, he would have to check in with a probation officer regularly. He would have to follow the law. If he broke any of those rules, he could be sent to prison to serve out that 7-year sentence. In addition to probation, Gary was also ordered to complete 300 hours of community service. Community service is when someone does unpaid work to benefit the community as part of their punishment. Gary would spend those 300 hours doing work at his local church. He mostly cut grass and did maintenance work around the church grounds. The result of Judge Sire's sentence was clear. Gary Plauché would not spend a single day in prison for killing Jeff Doucette. Other than the time he had already spent in jail immediately after his arrest while waiting for bail, Gary was a free man. He could go home. He could go back to work. He could be with his family. For many people in Baton Rouge, this was exactly the right decision. They cheered the judge's ruling. They felt that Gary had already been through enough. They believed that any father in Gary's position would have wanted to do the same thing. And they didn't think Gary deserved to rot in a prison cell for the rest of his life for killing the man who had destroyed his son's childhood. But not everyone felt that way. Jeff Doucette had a family too, and they were outraged. Doucette's mother, a woman named Elia Doucette, spoke to reporters after the sentencing. She was furious. In a manner of speaking, she said, "They are just telling him to go out and kill again." Elia Doucette felt that the judge's decision sent a dangerous message. If Gary Plauché could kill someone and get away with no prison time, what was stopping other people from doing the same thing? What was stopping any person who felt they had been wronged from taking the law into their own hands? Elia Doucette believed that her son should have had his day in court. She believed that the justice system should have been allowed to punish Jeff Doucette if he was found guilty. She didn't believe that Gary Plauché had the right to act as judge, jury, and executioner. And she thought the suspended sentence was a slap in the face to her family and to the concept of justice itself. The Doucette family's anger was understandable. Jeff Doucette had never been convicted of any crime. He had been arrested. He had been charged with kidnapping. But he had never gone to trial. He had never been found guilty by a jury. In the American justice system, people are supposed to be innocent until proven guilty. Jeff Doucette died before he could be proven guilty in a court of law. Of course, the evidence against him was overwhelming. The medical tests proved that Jody had been sexually abused. Doucette had confessed to the police officers escorting him back from California that he had abused other boys in the past. And Jody himself had confirmed what Doucette had done to him. But legally speaking, Doucette had not been convicted, and his family felt that he deserved a trial like anyone else, no matter what he had done. The fact that Gary Plauché had taken that opportunity away by killing Doucette and then received no prison time for it was something the Doucette family could never accept. Beyond the Doucette family, there were other people across the country who questioned Judge Sire's decision. Legal experts and commentators debated whether the sentence was appropriate. Some argued that the judge had made the right call, based on the unique circumstances of the case. Others argued that the lenient sentence set a dangerous precedent. A precedent is a decision that can be used as an example for future cases. If Gary Plauché could kill someone and get no prison time, couldn't other people use that as justification for their own acts of revenge? What if someone's spouse was murdered and they tracked down the killer and shot them? Would they also get a suspended sentence? What if someone's business partner stole from them? Could they kill that person and claim they were in a temporary psychotic state? Critics worried that Gary's case could open the door to more vigilante justice. And vigilante justice is dangerous because it takes power away from the legal system and puts it in the hands of individuals who might not make rational decisions. But supporters of the decision pointed out that Gary's case was truly unique. It wasn't just that Jeff Doucette had committed a crime against Gary's son. It was the specific nature of that crime. It was the grooming, the manipulation, the year of abuse, the kidnapping, the trauma. All of those factors combined to create a situation that pushed Gary into a mental breakdown. The psychiatric evaluation by Dr. Edward P. Uzzi had shown that Gary genuinely could not tell right from wrong when he killed Doucette. Gary had developed delusions. He believed he was on a righteous mission. He believed he heard the voice of Jesus telling him to kill Doucette. These weren't things that Gary made up to get out of trouble. These were genuine psychological symptoms that Dr. Uzzi had documented, and they were symptoms that had developed specifically because of what Doucette had done to Jody. In other words, this wasn't a case of someone just deciding they wanted revenge and then claiming they were crazy to avoid punishment. This was a case of someone who had actually suffered a psychological break because of extreme circumstances. Gary's defense attorney, Anthony Marabella, had written in his argument to the judge that there was virtually no risk that Gary would commit another crime. Marabella also wrote that putting Gary in prison would not serve any useful purpose, and he argued that giving Gary probation instead of prison time would not take away from the seriousness of the crime. All of these arguments had clearly resonated with Judge Sire. The judge had weighed the facts. He had considered the psychiatric reports. He had looked at Gary's background and his lack of any prior criminal history. He had thought about what would actually be accomplished by sending Gary to prison, and he had decided that prison wasn't the answer. Whether people agreed with that decision or not, Judge Sire had made it clear that he believed it was the right one for this specific case. Gary completed his 300 hours of community service by 1989. He finished cutting grass at his church. He fulfilled all the requirements of his probation, and he never got in trouble with the law again. Judge Sire had been right. Gary posed no threat to society. He went back to his life as a heavy equipment salesman. He coached his kids' sports teams. He tried to be a good father, but his life would never be completely normal again. The video of him shooting Jeff Doucette had been seen by millions of people. It had been played on news programs. It had been featured in documentaries. Gary Plauché was famous, whether he wanted to be or not. And for the rest of his life, people would recognize him as the man who shot his son's abuser on live television. Years later, Gary was interviewed about the shooting. He was asked if he regretted what he had done. Gary's answer was simple and direct. He said he had no regrets. If he had to do it all over again, he would. He still believed that he had done the right thing. He still believed that Jeff Doucette deserved to die for what he had done to Jody. And he still believed that any parent in his position would have wanted to do the same thing. When his wife June had visited him in jail on the night of the shooting, the first thing she said to him was, "You're going to hell for this. You know that, right?" But Gary didn't seem to care. Hell or not, jail or not, he had done what he felt he needed to do. And Judge Frank Sire's decision meant that Gary would never have to pay for it with his freedom. Section 8. Jody's Aftermath. The Long Road to Healing. When Jody Plauché first heard that his father had shot Jeff Doucette at the airport, he was not relieved. He was not happy. He was angry. At his father. Jody didn't want Jeff Doucette dead. He didn't want his abuser killed. He just wanted the abuse to stop. "I didn't want him dead," Jody said years later in an interview with ESPN. "I just wanted him to stop." When Jody learned what his father had done, his immediate feeling was anger. "After the shooting happened, I was very upset with what my father did," Jody told The Advocate in 2019. "I did not want Jeff killed. I felt like he was going to go to jail, and that was enough for me." This reaction might seem strange to people who didn't live through what Jody lived through. Most people assumed that Jody would be happy Doucette was dead. The man who had abused him for nearly a year, the man who had kidnapped him and taken him across the country, was gone. Wasn't that a good thing? But Jody's feelings were much more complicated than that. Despite everything Doucette had done to him, Jody had still seen Doucette as a friend. That's how good Doucette had been at grooming him. That's how effective the manipulation had been. Jody still struggled with what his father had done. It didn't help that the entire country was talking about it. The video of Gary shooting Doucette had been shown on news programs across America. People everywhere had opinions about what Gary had done. Some people thought Gary was a hero. Other people thought Gary was a murderer. But nobody was really asking Jody how he felt about it. And even if they did ask, Jody probably couldn't have explained his feelings in a way that made sense. He was 11 years old. He had been abused for a year. He had been kidnapped. He had been rescued. And now his father had killed his abuser on camera. How was an 11-year-old supposed to process all of that? The relationship between Jody and his father became strained. Gary and Jody had always been close. But after the shooting, things changed. Jody was dealing with anger and confusion. Gary was dealing with the legal system and the possibility of going to prison. The whole family was under enormous stress. The media attention was overwhelming. Everywhere they went, people recognized them. Jody couldn't escape the story. Even in his own hometown of Baton Rouge, people knew who he was. They knew what had happened to him. They knew what his father had done. It was like living in a fishbowl where everyone could see inside your life. Jody said it probably wasn't until later that summer that his relationship with his dad started to get back to normal. The shooting happened in March of 1984. By August of that year, Jody and Gary were starting to repair their relationship. They were starting to talk to each other again in a normal way. But it took time. It took months for Jody to work through his anger and his complicated feelings about what had happened. One of the reasons Jody had never told anyone about the abuse was because of something his father had said. Gary used to tell people, "If anybody ever touches my kid, I'll kill him." Jody knew his father wasn't kidding. Gary said this often enough that Jody understood it was a serious statement. So when the abuse started, Jody kept quiet. He was afraid that if he told his dad what Doucette was doing, his dad would kill Doucette, and then his dad would go to jail, or his dad would get in trouble, or something terrible would happen. Jody didn't want that. So he stayed silent. "My dad was absolutely too extreme," Jody said later. "He used to tell people, 'If anybody ever touches my kid, I'll kill him.' I knew he wasn't kidding. That's why I couldn't tell anybody, and that's exactly what he ended up doing." Gary's extreme statements had created a situation where Jody felt like he couldn't ask for help. And then, when the truth finally came out, Gary did exactly what he had said he would do. He killed the person who had touched his kid. In a way, Jody's worst fear had come true. Not the fear of being abused, because that had already happened, but the fear that his dad would do something drastic and permanent that could never be undone. Years later, as an adult, Jody would speak publicly about how parents should talk to their children about abuse. He would tell parents not to use extreme language like Gary did, because when you tell your child that you'll kill anyone who hurts them, you're not protecting them. You're making it harder for them to come forward. Jody received a letter once from a woman who had told her daughter, "If somebody ever touches you inappropriately, it's not murder. It's worse than murder. It kills a child's soul." When Jody read that, he immediately understood the problem with that kind of language. "So what's that little girl supposed to say if she ever gets molested?" Jody explained. "She doesn't want her soul to die, so she doesn't tell anybody." Despite everything that happened, despite the anger and the confusion and the complicated feelings, Jody went on to have what most people would consider a successful life. He finished high school. He became a 4-sport letterman, which means he competed in 4 different sports and earned a letter in each one. Sports had always been a big part of Jody's life before Doucette came along. When Jody was younger, he played football, basketball, baseball, and other sports. But once Doucette started grooming him, Doucette convinced Jody to quit all his other activities so he could focus on karate. It was a classic isolation tactic. Doucette wanted Jody all to himself, so he convinced Jody to give up the other things he loved. After everything that happened, Jody went back to sports. He played multiple sports in high school and excelled at them. It was one way for him to reclaim something that Doucette had taken from him. After high school, Jody went to Louisiana State University, which everyone calls LSU. At LSU, Jody studied general studies with minors in philosophy, speech communication, and psychology. These were not random choices. Jody was clearly trying to understand what had happened to him. Philosophy deals with big questions about life and morality. Speech communication is about how people talk to each other and share information. Psychology is the study of how the human mind works. All of these subjects gave Jody tools to make sense of his own experiences. While he was at LSU, Jody also got involved in activism. He served on the executive board of an organization called Men Against Violence. This was Jody's first step toward turning his painful experiences into something that could help other people. After graduating from LSU, Jody moved to Pennsylvania. He got a job at the Victim Services Center of Montgomery County. There, he worked as a sexual assault counselor for 7 years. This was remarkable. Jody, who had been a victim of sexual abuse himself, was now helping other victims navigate their own trauma. Most of the people Jody worked with in Pennsylvania didn't know his background. They didn't know that he was the kid from that famous case in Louisiana. They didn't know his father was Gary Plauché. They just knew him as Jody, a counselor who was good at his job and who cared about helping people. For Jody, this was probably a relief. It gave him a chance to have his own identity, separate from the famous incident that had defined his childhood. But even though Jody had moved away and built a new life, he couldn't completely escape his past. In 1993, when Jody was about 21 years old, he wrote a 27,000-word manuscript about what had happened to him. That's about as long as a short book. Jody poured his story onto the page, describing the abuse, the kidnapping, his father's actions, and everything that came after. But he didn't publish it. He wasn't ready yet. The manuscript sat there for years, a record of his experience that nobody else saw. In 2005, Jody moved back to Baton Rouge. His father Gary had suffered a stroke, and Jody wanted to be closer to family. He went to work for his brother's company, Cody's Transportation. Life had settled into a quieter routine. Gary's health was declining, but the family was together. Gary Plauché died in October of 2014. He was 68 years old. He had suffered his first stroke in 2011, and then he had another stroke that led to his death 3 years later. In the years before he died, Gary had done a few interviews about the shooting. In one interview, when he was 67 years old, Gary was asked if he regretted killing Jeff Doucette. Gary's answer was clear. He had no regrets. He said he would do it again if he had to. "If somebody did it to your kid, you'd do it too," Gary said, repeating the same thing he had said to Deputy Mike Barnett on the night of the shooting. Gary never wavered in his belief that he had done the right thing. Jody said that his father would have sad moments every now and then because he had taken a life. But Gary never regretted it. He believed until the day he died that killing Jeff Doucette was the only option. After his father's death, Jody started thinking seriously about publishing his story. A friend convinced him that it was time. 3 years after Gary died, Jody finally decided to finish the book he had started writing back in 1993. He rewrote and updated the manuscript. In August of 2019, the book was published. It was called Why, Gary, Why? The Jody Plauché Story. The title came from the question that Deputy Mike Barnett had asked Gary right after the shooting. Those 3 words, "Why, Gary, why?" had become famous. They captured the confusion and the anguish of that moment, and they were the perfect title for a book that tried to answer that question from the perspective of the person at the centre of it all. In the book, Jody was careful about how much detail he included about the abuse. "I left a lot of stuff out," Jody told the advocate. His mother June had asked him why he didn't put more details in there, but Jody had thought carefully about this. "I have to dance a fine line," he explained, "between triggering a victim who might be reading the book and having to put the book down, and a paedophile reading the book like Penthouse Forum. Oh, this is great. I didn't need to go into explicit details or the grossest, nasty stuff." Jody understood that his book would be read by different types of people. Some readers would be survivors of abuse who might be triggered by graphic descriptions. Other readers might be predators who would take pleasure in reading about a child being abused. Jody didn't want to give either group what they were looking for. He wanted to tell his story in a way that was honest but also responsible. The goal of the book was simple. "I wanted to give victims hope," Jody said. "I wanted to give parents knowledge, and I wanted outsiders to get a general understanding about sexual violence and sexual abuse." Jody wanted victims to know that they could survive and even thrive after abuse. He wanted parents to understand how predators operate so they could protect their children. And he wanted people who had never experienced abuse to understand what it's really like. Since the book came out, Jody has heard from many parents who told him they learned things they never would have thought of. One of the most important things Jody tells parents is to watch out for adults who want to spend more time with your kids than you do. If someone wants to spend more time with your kids than you do, that's a red flag, Jody said. That was exactly what Jeff Doucette had done. He had inserted himself into the Plauché family. He had become someone June trusted completely. He was at their house all the time. He was always offering to take Jody places, to spend time with him, to give him special attention, and nobody thought it was strange because Doucette seemed like such a nice guy. Jody also became a public speaker. He started giving talks about his experience and about how to prevent child sexual abuse. He appeared on television programs and podcasts. He spoke at schools and community centres. In 2012, he was featured in an ESPN special report called A Time to Kill, the Jody Plauché story. In that program, Jody talked openly about the abuse, the kidnapping, and his father's actions. By this point, Jody had come to terms with what his father did. He understood why Gary did it, even if he didn't agree with it. It's not right to take someone's life, Jody told ESPN. But when someone's that bad a person, it doesn't bother you much in the long run. Jody's views on his father's actions have been complex and have evolved over the years. In some interviews, he has said he cannot and will not condone what his father did. He has said he would have preferred to see Doucette face justice through the legal system. I think for a lot of people who have not been satisfied by the American justice system, my dad stands as a symbol of justice, Jody said in one interview. I understand why he did it, absolutely, and I know my dad, and when he said he would kill anyone who touched me, I knew he'd kill him. But I cannot and will not condone his behaviour. In other interviews, Jody has been more forgiving and understanding. He has called his father the greatest dad of all time. In a 2024 interview, Jody said, "I wouldn't trade my life. Knowing how it turned out, I wouldn't trade it in for anything." These seemingly contradictory statements show how complicated Jody's feelings are. He can understand why his father did what he did, while also wishing it hadn't happened. He can love his father deeply, while also believing that killing someone was wrong. He can appreciate that his father was trying to protect him, while also recognizing that the extreme action created its own trauma. This is what real life looks like. It's messy, it's complicated, it doesn't fit into neat categories of right and wrong. Jody has spent decades processing these feelings, and even now, more than 40 years after the shooting, he's still working through them. One of the challenges Jody faces is that people constantly remind him of what happened. Even when he tries to move on and live a normal life, the past follows him. Jody enjoys cooking and sometimes posts cooking videos on YouTube, but inevitably, someone in the comments will write, "Your dad's a hero." Jody has said this frustrates him. "I'll post a cooking video on YouTube and someone will comment, 'Your dad's a hero,'" he explained. They won't say, "That gumbo looks fantastic." They'll just say things like, "Your father is a hero." Jody can't even share a hobby without people bringing up the shooting. The incident has defined his life in ways he can't escape, no matter how much time passes. Jody has also been honest about how the abuse affected his personal life. He said that when he started dating in high school, he had a girlfriend for a few years. She helped him through a lot. But Jody also realized that he had a tendency to be controlling in relationships, which he recognized was connected to his past trauma. The abuse had taken away his control, and as he grew up, he found himself trying to control situations as a way of feeling safe. Recognizing this pattern was an important part of his healing process. Jody has said that he doesn't want to have children. "I don't want kids," he told ESPN. "Do I not want them because of what happened? Probably." The abuse affected his views on family, on trust, on relationships. It changed the trajectory of his life in ways both big and small. But despite all of this, Jody has dedicated his adult life to making sure what happened to him doesn't happen to other children. He continues to speak publicly about child sexual abuse. He educates parents on the tactics that predators use. He provides hope to survivors. In 2024, 40 years after the shooting, Jody was still giving interviews and sharing his story. He has worked with organizations that support victims of sexual violence. He has participated in panels alongside other advocates, including people like boxer Sugar Ray Leonard and kidnapping victim Elizabeth Smart, who have their own stories of abuse and survival. Jody's work has reached thousands of people. Parents have messaged him to say his book taught them things they never knew. Survivors have reached out to say his story gave them hope. And through it all, Jody has maintained that his father, despite what he did, was a good man who loved his family. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 9. Gary's Final Years and Lasting Legacy. After Gary Plauché was sentenced in August of 1985, he went back to living what most people would call a normal life. He returned to his job as a heavy equipment salesman in Baton Rouge. This was the same work he had been doing before the shooting. Gary sold big machines like bulldozers, excavators, and other construction equipment to businesses that needed them. It was honest work that required him to know a lot about the equipment and to be good with people. And Gary had always been good with people. Friends and family described him as someone who could make anyone laugh. He was the kind of person who lit up a room when he walked in. He loved telling jokes. He loved entertaining people. He was fun to be around. Gary also stayed involved with his children's lives. He volunteered to coach their sports teams. Even though his own childhood had been turned upside down by what happened, his other kids, Bubba, Mikey and Sissy, still needed their father. Gary showed up for them. He went to their games. He helped with their homework. He tried to be the best father he could be. Tony Marabella Jr., who had been one of Gary's defense attorneys and later became a judge, said that Gary went back to a semi-regular life after the trial. Regular in the sense that he worked during the day and spent evenings with his family. Irregular in the sense that he would never be able to fully escape what had happened. One of the requirements of Gary's probation was that he could not drink alcohol. This was a significant change for Gary, who had been known to enjoy drinking with his friends at the Cotton Club and other places around Baton Rouge. Part of why Gary and his wife June had been separated in the first place was because of Gary's drinking. After the shooting, as part of his probation terms, Gary had to stay sober. For a while, this actually helped Gary and June's relationship. They got back together because Gary couldn't drink anymore. Without alcohol in the picture, they were able to work on their marriage. But their reunion didn't last forever. Once Gary finished his probation in 1989, after completing all 300 hours of community service and following all the rules for 5 years, he was free from those restrictions. And he went back to drinking. By 1991, Gary and June split up again. They never officially divorced, but they lived separately. Despite these personal struggles, Gary remained close with his children. His son Bubba played music and would perform at family gatherings and community events. Gary loved fishing and cooking, two hobbies that brought him joy. He was a huge fan of the LSU Tigers and the New Orleans Saints. When football season came around, Gary would watch the games with friends and family, cheering for his teams. These were the simple pleasures that made up Gary's life in the years after the shooting. He wasn't living under a spotlight anymore. He was just a guy in Baton Rouge who loved his kids, liked to fish, and enjoyed a good Saints game. But the shooting never completely went away. The video of Gary killing Jeff Doucette continued to circulate. Over the years, it was featured in television documentaries and news programs. In 1994, the footage appeared in a documentary called Traces of Death 2. In 2002, it showed up in Michael Moore's documentary Bowling for Columbine, which was about gun violence in America. The video was uploaded to YouTube, where it has been viewed more than 20 million times. Millions of people around the world have watched Gary Plauché shoot Jeff Doucette in the head at the Baton Rouge airport. For some of those viewers, Gary was a hero. For others, he was a cautionary tale about what happens when people take the law into their own hands. But for Gary himself, the attention was probably exhausting. He had done this thing in a moment of rage and grief, and now it would follow him for the rest of his life. Gary and Jody occasionally appeared on television programs together to talk about what happened. In 2012, when Jody was 40 years old, they were both featured in an ESPN special report called A Time to Kill, the Jody Plauché story. In that program, Gary was asked if he regretted killing Jeff Doucette. Gary's answer was the same as it had always been. He had no regrets. He said he would do it again if he had to. "If somebody did it to your kid, you'd do it too," Gary said, repeating the words he had spoken to Deputy Mike Barnett on the night of the shooting 28 years earlier. Gary never wavered in his belief that he had done the right thing, but Jody has said that his father did have moments of sadness. "He would have bouts every now and then," Jody explained in an interview. "I don't want to say depressed, but he would get a little sad every now and then because he had taken a life. But he never regretted it, and he would have done it again." In 2011, Gary suffered a stroke. A stroke is when blood flow to part of the brain is blocked or reduced, which can cause serious damage. Gary survived the stroke, but it left him with health problems. His quality of life declined. He needed more help taking care of himself. 3 years later, in 2014, Gary suffered a second stroke. This one was much worse. The second stroke was caused by complications from diabetes, a disease that affects how the body processes sugar and can lead to all kinds of health problems if not managed properly. Gary had been dealing with diabetes for some time. The combination of diabetes and the second stroke was too much for his body to handle. Gary Plauché died on Tuesday, October 21st, 2014, at a nursing home in Baton Rouge. He was 68 years old. He wasn't a killer. He was a father who had protected his son in the only way he knew how. Gary was survived by his wife June Sheridan Plauché, his daughter Sissy Jennifer, and his 3 sons, Gary Jr., who everyone called Bubba, Joseph Boyce, known as Jody, and Jeffrey Michael, called Mikey. He was also survived by his brother Jeff and numerous grandchildren, including Mason, Zachary, Cody, Canton, Younger, Dylan, Briley, Bentley, Charles, Annabelle, and Amelia. Gary had lived to see his children grow up and have children of their own. He had been a grandfather. He had watched his family expand, and despite everything that had happened, despite the shooting and the trial and the decades of attention, he had managed to maintain relationships with the people he loved most. The funeral service for Gary was held on Friday, October 24th, 2014, at St. George Catholic Church in Baton Rouge. Visitation started at 11 o'clock in the morning, followed by a mass of Christian burial at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Friends and family came to pay their respects. The guest book and online memorial were filled with messages from people whose lives Gary had touched. Many of the messages called him a hero. "You are forever a hero and never was a better father born than you," one person wrote. "You will always be remembered and admired." Another person wrote, "Gary, you are missed. Your kindness and compassion, along with your firm dedication to being a father and a true man who did the right thing. Rest in eternal peace, my friend. May God hold you and keep you." But not everyone who left a message focused on the shooting. Many people simply remembered Gary as a good friend, a kind neighbour, or a fun person to be around. "Mr. Gary will always be remembered as a faithful friend to my dad and my family," one person wrote. "He will be missed." A neighbour wrote, "We will miss Gary. We were neighbours since you guys were in elementary, middle and high school. The entire Plauché family were very close to my son Brandon, and we will always remember Gary's kindness and support." These messages show that Gary was more than just the man in the white baseball cap who shot Jeff Doucette. He was a real person with a full life. He had friends. He was part of a community. He made people laugh. He helped his neighbours. He loved his family. The obituary requested that instead of sending flowers, people could make donations to Juvenile Diabetes Research or the American Diabetes Association. This was fitting, since diabetes had contributed to Gary's death. The family wanted something positive to come from his passing, even if it was just donations to help find better treatments for a disease that affects millions of people. Gary was buried at St. George Catholic Church Cemetery in Baton Rouge, the same church where his funeral service was held. It's a peaceful place where his family can visit him. After a life that had been marked by so much drama and controversy, Gary's final resting place is quiet and unremarkable, just like he probably would have wanted it to be. The legacy that Gary Plauché left behind is complicated. To some people, especially in Baton Rouge, Gary is remembered as a hero. He's seen as a symbol of parental protection taken to its most extreme form. He's the father who did what many fathers might want to do but would never actually do. He's proof that some crimes are so terrible that people will forgive almost anything if it's done in response to those crimes. The fact that Gary received no prison time for killing Jeff Doucette sent a message to the world. That message is open to interpretation. Some people see it as justice. Others see it as a dangerous example of vigilante violence being rewarded. To other people, Gary represents something darker. He represents what happens when someone decides they are above the law. He took a life. He denied Jeff Doucette the right to a trial. He made himself judge, jury, and executioner. And then he got away with it. Critics of Gary's actions worry that his case set a precedent that could be used to justify other acts of revenge. If Gary Plauché can kill someone on camera and walk free, what's to stop the next person from doing the same thing? The answer, of course, is that Gary's case was unique. The circumstances were so extreme that it's unlikely another case exactly like it will ever happen again. But the worry remains. For his family, Gary's legacy is more personal. Jody has spent decades grappling with what his father did. In some interviews, Jody has called Gary the greatest dad of all time. In others, he has said he cannot and will not condone what his father did. Both of these things can be true at the same time. Gary was Jody's father. He loved Jody. He wanted to protect Jody. But the way he chose to do that created a whole new set of problems. It put Jody in the spotlight. It made him famous for something horrible that happened to him. It killed a man who, despite being Jody's abuser, Jody still had complicated feelings about. Gary's other children, Bubba, Mikey, and Sissy, have had to live with the legacy of what their father did as well. They lost their father to a stroke in 2014, but they had already lost a piece of him back in 1984 when he made the decision to bring a gun to that airport. The video of Gary shooting Jeff Doucette will continue to circulate on the internet for as long as the internet exists. New generations of people will discover it. They will watch Gary spin around from that payphone. They will see the gun come up. They will hear the shot. They will see Doucette fall. And they will form their own opinions about whether Gary Plauché was a hero or a murderer. Most likely, the truth is somewhere in between. Gary Plauché was a man who loved his children so much that he was willing to throw away his own freedom to make sure the person who hurt his son could never hurt anyone else again. Whether that makes him a hero or a criminal is a question that each person has to answer for themselves. Section 10. Where are they now? The impact 4 decades later. In March of 2024, Jody Plauché celebrated the 40th anniversary of the shooting that changed his life. He didn't spend the day mourning or hiding from the world. Instead, he was in Austin, Texas, attending a wedding party with his godson and his godson's brother. He was also planning to see his friend, comedian Jim Norton, perform live. Jody wasn't running from his past anymore. He had learned to live with it. In an interview that year, Jody said something that would have been hard to imagine back in 1984, when he was an angry, confused 11-year-old boy. "I wouldn't trade my life," Jody said. "Knowing how it turned out, I wouldn't trade it in for anything." 4 decades after being abused, kidnapped, and thrust into the national spotlight when his father shot his abuser on live television, Jody Plauché had found peace. But getting to that point of peace took a long time. It took decades of work. Jody's journey from victim to survivor to advocate was not a straight line. It was full of difficult moments, setbacks, and breakthroughs. The first major turning point came in 1991, when Jody was 19 years old. He appeared on his first talk show to discuss what had happened to him. Going on television and talking about being sexually abused was not an easy thing to do, especially for a young man. There's a lot of shame and stigma around male sexual abuse. Many people don't talk about it because they're embarrassed, or they think people won't believe them. But Jody decided to share his story publicly. He talked about Jeff Doucette, about the grooming, about the abuse, about the kidnapping, and about his father's actions. He spoke honestly and openly about experiences that many people would want to keep hidden forever. A few days after the show aired, Jody got a phone call that would change the direction of his life. It was the Baton Rouge sheriff on the other end of the line. The sheriff told Jody that a young boy had seen his interview on television. That boy had been suffering abuse at the hands of a local pastor. Seeing Jody talk about his own abuse gave the boy the courage to come forward and tell someone what was happening to him. The pastor was arrested and charged with child molestation. A predator was stopped because Jody had been willing to share his story. "That's the moment where I decided that I'm going to keep raising awareness," Jody said years later. "I'm going to keep speaking out, and hopefully, I can make a difference." That phone call became the spark that launched Jody's career in public speaking and activism. If telling his story could help even one child escape abuse, then all the difficulty and pain of talking about it publicly was worth it. Over the years, Jody has met many famous people through his advocacy work. He's met basketball legend Shaquille O'Neal. He's met Little Richard, the rock and roll pioneer. He's met Peggy Sue, whose name became famous because of the Buddy Holly song. And he's become friends with comedian Jim Norton, who Jody considers a close friend. These celebrity encounters are interesting, but they're not what motivates Jody. What motivates him are the messages he gets from parents who read his book and tell him they learned things they never would have thought of. What motivates him are the survivors who reach out to say his story gave them hope. What motivates him is the idea that he can prevent what happened to him from happening to someone else. Jody's message to parents is clear and direct. He tells them to watch for red flags. One of the biggest red flags is when an adult wants to spend more time with your child than you do. That's exactly what Jeff Doucette did. He inserted himself into the Plauché family. He was always around. He was always offering to take Jody places, to give him rides, to spend time with him. And because Doucette seemed like such a nice guy, nobody questioned it. Jody also tells parents not to use extreme language when talking to their children about abuse. Don't say things like, "If anyone touches you, I'll kill them." Gary Plauché used to say that all the time, and Jody knew his father wasn't joking. So when the abuse started, Jody kept quiet because he didn't want his father to do something that would land him in prison. He didn't want to be responsible for his father killing someone. The very thing Gary said to protect Jody actually prevented Jody from asking for help. Another important message Jody shares is for survivors themselves. "You're not scarred for life," Jody tells them. "You're not damaged goods. You're innocence that may have been taken, but for the most part, you're going to be okay." This is a powerful message because so many survivors of abuse feel broken. They feel like what happened to them has permanently damaged them in ways that can never be fixed. Jody's life is proof that healing is possible. Yes, he went through something terrible. Yes, it affected him in lasting ways. He said he doesn't want children, and he thinks that decision is probably connected to what happened to him. He's talked about being controlling in relationships and having to work on that. But he also went to college. He had a career helping other survivors. He wrote a book. He became a public speaker. He made friends. He laughed. He lived. He didn't let what Jeff Doucette did to him define the rest of his life. Jody currently lives back in Baton Rouge, the same city where everything happened. After working in Pennsylvania for 7 years as a sexual assault counselor, Jody returned home in 2005 when his father Gary suffered his first stroke. Jody went to work for his brother's company, Cody's Transportation, but he never stopped his advocacy work. He continued to give speeches and interviews. He worked on perfecting the manuscript he had written back in 1993 about his experiences. And in August of 2019, he finally published his book, Why Gary Why? The Jody Plauché Story. The book tells his story in detail, though Jody was careful not to include graphic descriptions that might trigger other survivors or provide material for predators. The book has been well received. Parents have told Jody they learned valuable information about how predators operate. Survivors have told Jody the book gave them hope. One thing that's interesting about Jody's current life is that he can't really escape his past, even when he wants to. Jody enjoys cooking. It's one of his hobbies. Sometimes he posts cooking videos on YouTube, just sharing recipes or techniques he's learned. But inevitably, someone in the comments will write, "Your dad's a hero." They won't talk about the food. They won't compliment the cooking. They'll just bring up the shooting. Every single time. I think for a lot of people who have not been satisfied by the American justice system, my dad stands as a symbol of justice, Jody explained. I understand why he did it, absolutely. And I know my dad, and when he said he would kill anyone who touched me, I knew he'd kill him. But I cannot and will not condone his behaviour. Jody believes his father gave Jeff Doucette the easy way out. Doucette died quickly. He didn't have to face a trial. He didn't have to sit in prison for years thinking about what he had done. He didn't have to face his victims or their families in court. He just died. In Jodi's view, that was too easy. But in other interviews, Jodi has spoken about his father with deep love and affection. He's called Gary the greatest dad of all time. He's talked about how Gary was the life of the party, how he loved cooking and telling jokes, how he had a soft spot for animals, and would pick up stray dogs or cats and bring them home. In the ESPN interview, Jodi acknowledged the complexity of his feelings. "It's not right to take someone's life," Jodi said, "but when someone's that bad a person, it doesn't bother you too much in the long run." These different statements might seem contradictory, but they show how Jodi is still working through his feelings about his father and about that night at the airport. He can love his father and disagree with what he did. He can understand his father's motivation while wishing it had happened differently. He can remember Gary as a great dad, while also recognizing that Gary's actions created problems that Jodi had to deal with for the rest of his life. In terms of the broader impact of the case, the Gary Plauché story continues to spark debate about vigilante justice, parental rights, the justice system, and how society responds to crimes against children. The case is studied in law schools as an example of how extreme circumstances can lead to lenient sentences. It's discussed in psychology classes as an example of temporary psychosis and the effects of trauma. It's referenced in debates about gun control and airport security. The video is used in criminal justice courses to show how media coverage can affect public opinion about a case. And it's shared constantly on social media, where people argue in the comments about whether Gary was right or wrong, whether he should have gone to prison, and what they would do in the same situation. The case also highlights the importance of recognizing and preventing child sexual abuse. Jeff Doucette was able to abuse Jodi for nearly a year without anyone noticing. He groomed not just Jodi, but the entire family. He built trust. He isolated Jodi from his other activities. He tested boundaries gradually, and he made Jodi feel like the abuse was somehow normal or okay. These are classic predator tactics. Jodi's advocacy work focuses on teaching parents and children to recognize these warning signs. If the Plauché family had known what to look for, maybe the abuse could have been stopped sooner. Maybe Jodi wouldn't have been kidnapped. And maybe Gary Plauché wouldn't have felt compelled to bring a gun to an airport and shoot a man in front of television cameras. One aspect of Jodi's advocacy that's particularly important is his focus on male survivors. There's still a lot of stigma around men and boys admitting they've been sexually abused. Society often expects men to be strong and tough. There's a false belief that boys can't be victims, or that if they are, it must somehow be their fault. Jodi speaking openly about what happened to him helps break down those stereotypes. He shows that male survivors exist, that what happened to them wasn't their fault, and that they can heal and live full lives. Every time Jodi shares his story, he gives permission to other male survivors to share theirs. And every time a survivor comes forward, another predator might be stopped. As of 2024, Jodi continues his advocacy work. He gives speeches at schools, community centres, and conferences. He participates in podcasts and interviews. He maintains a presence on social media, where he shares information about child safety and abuse prevention. He remains connected to the community of survivors and advocates. And he honours his father's memory, while also maintaining his own perspective on what happened. Jodi understands that many people see his father as a hero. He understands that the community of Baton Rouge supported Gary and wanted him to walk free. He understands that millions of people around the world have watched that video and thought, I would do the same thing. But Jodi also knows something those people don't know. He knows what it's like to be the person at the centre of it all. He knows what it's like to have your father kill someone because of what happened to you. He knows what it's like to carry that weight for 4 decades. The legacy of March 16, 1984 extends far beyond the individuals directly involved. It's become part of true crime history. It's become a case study in criminology, psychology, and law. It's become a viral video that shocks each new generation that discovers it. And it's become a springboard for important conversations about child safety, justice, vengeance, and healing. Jeff Doucette is dead. Gary Plauché is dead. But Jodi Plauché is alive. And he's chosen to use his experience, as painful as it was, to help others. He's turned his trauma into purpose. He's taken the worst thing that ever happened to him and made it mean something. That's what resilience looks like. That's what healing looks like. Not forgetting, not pretending it didn't happen, but deciding that what happened to you won't be the only thing that defines you. "I wouldn't trade my life," Jody said in 2024. "Knowing how it turned out, I wouldn't trade it in for anything." That statement is remarkable when you think about everything Jody has been through, but it makes sense when you understand that Jody has found meaning in his suffering. He's helped other children stay safe. He's given hope to other survivors. He's educated thousands of parents. He's made a difference. And that, perhaps more than anything else, is the real ending to this story. Not a man shot dead in an airport, not a father who escaped prison, but a survivor who turned his pain into purpose and used his voice to protect others from experiencing what he went through. That's the legacy that matters. That's the part of this story that should be remembered. If you liked this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.